You could have gotten any product job at any company out there. Why did you want to go start a company?
Being a founder was not on my radar at all. A lot of my friends are like, dude, why aren't you working with AI companies? And I'm like, because all the consumer ones suck. So I was wrestling with this fact of like, well, I'm not really in the game on AI, but I do believe it's like the next wave. And if I don't build directly with it, what are the CPO jobs I'm going to get in a year or 18 months? At worst, I learn how to use these new tools to build cool things. And at best, we built an iconic company. My co-founder was like, look, we should go start a network product that can only be built with AI. Well, if we can use AI to document what's in people's heads and separate like time spent from value of advice given, then we could go get the best operators, which are currently not participating in these markets because everyone wants to learn the best operators. We did build a deck for Greylock. It looks pretty embarrassing now. We spent, like a week or so on this thing. And afterwards, it sort of felt like the deck was irrelevant because they largely thought most of the stuff in the deck was pretty dumb. But fortunately, they didn't think we were dumb.
Casey, thanks so much for joining us. Really excited to have you on the first pitch. For those that don't know Casey, I would love for you to give us a quick little background on your experience. I got to meet you through the Reforge community and definitely really admire a lot of the work that you've done and excited to have you on the pod.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yes, I'm Casey, co-founder and CEO of SuperMe. We're building an AI native professional network. A little bit of background about me. I started my career as an analyst. And it was my job to measure all the ways we drove leads to apartment buildings at apartments.com. And so that helped me learn about a bunch of things that did that online: SEO, Google AdWords, affiliate marketing, emails, all that kind of stuff. So naturally started working on optimizing all of those things once I measured them for effectiveness, and then started working on trying to make the landing pages convert better and trying to figure out why people would use us instead of, Craigslist. And people said I was this weird marketing and product hybrid and that they didn't know what to do with that, and that I should pick a lane and specialize, which I definitely did not want to do. So I worked on a bunch of entrepreneurial projects at that company, which was a joint venture of all the newspaper companies, eventually building like a truly a Zillow competitor in real estate, where I led all the like online marketing, analytics, and biz dev. And after doing that for a year and a half, it was 2008. Looked like maybe not the best time to be building a real estate startup. Some people that used to work at that company had started this company called Grubhub, which had raised a 1 million Series A, which I know now sounds like a small seed round, but that's how things worked in Chicago back in the day. And, they were looking for their first marketing person. Their remit was like, look, I don't care what the hell you work on. I just need the number of people that order food to double in the next couple of months, which was perfect for me, right? Because I loved trying all these different things. Basically led the demand side growth from Series A to IPO at Grubhub. So all the city expansion type stuff. Everything we did to, acquire and retain people that would order food from restaurants. So things like ranking number one for every food delivery keyword, spending double-digit millions on AdWords, building loyalty programs, building out email programs, all that kind of stuff. And, I did that for 5.5 years. And I think in year 4, Andrew Chen came out with the post that growth hacker is the new VP of marketing. And I was like, oh, there's finally someone on the internet that understands what I do. So I was doing my MBA at night while at Grubhub. And when I finished, I was like, yeah, I really don't think the next startup I'm going to work at is probably going to be in Chicago. I should go check out Silicon Valley, and ended up joining Pinterest. They had a growth team. They called it growth. I became a growth PM, ended up leading the growth team there from 40 mil to 150 mil active users, basically rebuilding the growth model of that company from something that was like a social network to a content network, that was based on personalization, and something that was growing on top of Facebook to something that was growing on top of Google. So I led all the work to kind of make us rank well in search engines, convert people from search engines, activate people from search engines, and then make sure they kept coming back with emails and notice. So did that for 3 years. Then really didn't know what I wanted to do next in my career. So I started advising at a VC, Greylock. Realized there that I had gone through a couple of these like early stage startup to big outcomes, and that most of the people in the portfolio, it's their first time doing it, whether they're the founder or whether they're the early employees or early executives. And since I had done it a couple times before, I knew like what things to focus on, what things were a waste of time, all the way from driving growth to product strategy to fundraising to hiring. So I quit Greylock to do that full time. Started advising lots of marketplaces, consumer companies, Airbnb, Canva, Thumbtack, Tinder, and one of my clients was Eventbrite, and got involved there because they were trying to make the shift from a primarily SaaS business model to a true marketplace model with network effects, which was something I was studying a lot at the time. Just ended up after a couple of years advising, joining there as chief product officer. Literally couldn't pick a worse time to have done that. It was shortly after that the pandemic hit and revenue went below zero, which I didn't even know was possible, and so we had to lay off 45% of the company. Julia asked me to rewrite the company strategy so that we could go convince private equity to give us money so we didn't die on a Saturday, so that we could discuss it on a Sunday, so that we could start pitching private equity on Monday. Fortunately, we were able to raise that capital. We were able to get the company through the pandemic and actually performing better after the pandemic, because we were losing like $5 million a year after IPO. And so we got the company to break even, got all the revenue back that we lost. And but that was 3.5 years of work that felt like a decade of work. So after that, I dropped down to being an advisor at Eventbrite, started advising some other companies, and then that eventually led to me starting SuperMe.
Throughout this entire journey, advising a bunch of companies, helping on the growth side, primarily being one of the godfathers of growth. Like, when in this journey did you say, hey, like, I actually want to go down this founder path myself?
So I was advising a company called Whatnot, which is like a collectibles live streaming marketplace. And my head of growth eng at Pinterest was the head of engineering there. So that's how I got involved. So as soon as I dropped down full time at Eventbrite, he was like, hey, do you have any spare time? I'd love your help. Didn't really have a product team at the time. Like a year into that, like ChatGPT dropped, and my co-founder was like, look, we should go start a network product that can only be built with AI. Being a founder was not on my radar at all, but me and Ludo have been trying to work together for a while since I left Pinterest. So I was like, look, probably not for me, but I'll help you brainstorm some ideas. If we find something we really like, we can go.
Did you
give it a
guys,
shot.
was it on this specific idea that brought you together, or were you guys like exploring other things and then this kind of came through that process?
Yeah, so pretty much in the first week, I came back to him and I was like, well, here are two like marketplace network areas that I think have been constrained historically that I think AI can unconstrain. And one of them was expertise networks. So these are, existing markets, but the best operators aren't really on them because they're busy and have jobs, and the extra income isn't that meaningful, and the people they talk to don't really compound, their network. So, the pitch I brought to him was like, well, if we can use AI to document what's in people's heads and separate like time spent from value of advice given, then we could go get the best operators, which are currently not participating in these markets. And if you go get the best operators that aren't participating in these markets, you actually expand the demand side of the market too, because everyone wants to learn from the best operators. And the current expertise networks are a little bit more, finance driven. So that was like the original pitch I came back to him with. And, it's obviously evolved since then. But that pretty quickly hit a nerve in both of us, where instead of exploring a bunch of other things, we were just honing in on that concept like pretty quickly.
And was he still at Whatnot when you guys were kind of riffing on these things, or was he like, okay, I'll just quit and we'll roll with it?
Yeah, so he was basically like, yeah, I should just quit and start building. Like he was really hot to trot on building with AI. And I was the one that was like, I don't know, bro. Like I don't know if I'm like an ideal founder.
And were you at Greylock at the time, and were you like, doing the advising thing with him?
No, so I was advising Whatnot. I was advising Robinhood, Etsy, Fair, and this small company called Vermont Commerce. So I kind of had like this full plate of commitments that I couldn't really like get out of. So that's why I was like, well, I definitely can't start now with you, but I can spend some time with you on it. And if we're finding things that we really like, then, eventually these commitments I can unwind from. So the concept was kind of like, let's jam on some things through the summer. Let's like prototype some things. And if we like where we are at, then by the end of the summer, I should be able to like unwind some of these commitments I have to go full time on it.
I guess like one of the things, so you talked about a bit like the seed of the idea, right? But like, what motivated you to want to actually start the company? Like, what was was this like an internal drive? Was this like you've been like advising and working with a bunch of founders and you're like, hey, I actually like, why did you want to go do this? Because you could have gotten any product job at any company out there. Like, why did you want to go start a company?
Yeah, no, it wasn't my plan. The coming out of Eventbrite and getting back into the advising world, like the plan I had was like, look, I'm gonna advise a little bit, but not be full time. And then in like a year or so, I'll jump back in and do chief product officer again at a little bit of a smaller company, less tech debt. And so that was my framing leaving Eventbrite, at the end of 2022. And then ChatGPT comes out. A lot of my friends are like, dude, why aren't you working with AI companies? That's like the thing. And I'm like, because all the consumer ones suck. And I primarily do consumer. And so I was wrestling with this fact of like, well, I'm not really in the game on AI, but I do believe it's like the next wave. My current business model of advising isn't fitting where the action is with AI very well. I'm not building directly with it. And if I don't build directly with it, what are the CPO jobs I'm going to get in a year or 18 months? Like, they're not going to be the most exciting ones, right? So that made founding and just, I mean, let's really call it not founding, let's really call it building with AI with someone you really like working with, feel a lot less risky. Because at worst, I learn how to use these new tools to build cool things. And at best, we build an iconic company. And this is the last job, I ever have. So that helped make it feel initially like, oh, a risky bet. I don't necessarily feel like super aligned with, to something that feels like a little bit more obvious in retrospect, to be like, let's just start building. And if we come up with something cool,
Yeah.
let's pursue it.
Did you have other ideas you were considering that you may have done, or was it like you felt really passionate about what SuperMe kind of is at that time?
Yeah, so I can give you a little bit more background on that. Like in like the first response, like the prompt from Ludo is essentially like network business AI, and it's like my immediate response is expertise networks, service marketplaces, historically constrained markets. I have a thesis on how AI can unconstrain both of them, and Dan Hockenmeyer had written like a public blog post on service marketplaces and what unconstrains that. And where I came at expertise marketplaces, I'd been selling my expertise not through these networks, but through, advising, through building courses through Reforge, for almost a decade at that point in time. And, Ludo had done some of that advising work himself, but, never full time. And so we had both a lot of this experience of, founders reaching out to us to try to understand how to do all sorts of tasks and scaling a company, getting a bunch of like, who do you know that's good at X, text messages. And so we felt like we understood both the supply and the demand side of this problem pretty well. And when I had left Pinterest, a friend of mine recommended this book. I think it's called Discover Your True North. And part of what it asks you to do is like write out a personal mission for your career. And so what I wrote, all the way back in 2017 was, my personal mission is to discover and scale the use of the best practices of building companies. And what I had been flirting with for, the next 5+ years was like, okay, what are all the axes on which you can play with that mission? So it was like, oh, well, if I blog, I can get a lot of reach, but really no personalization. If I write courses, I can get like a little bit deeper, impact on individuals, but it's still not personalized. If I advise, I can get super personal, but not much reach. And of course, if you take an executive job, you get the deepest impact, but the least reach across the industry. So I've been playing with all of these different modes, but there really wasn't like ever an idea of there being a software solution to that personal mission until AI came along. And I was like, well, wait a minute. Like, now I can try to apply this across all the great operators, because I know 1% of what's important, when it comes to building companies. So that's why it felt kind of like more instantaneous to go after this, because it had really been a problem I've been working on for like a decade already.
I was gonna say definitely. So it sounds like mission driven. Like this was something that you cared a lot about, and kind of extended some of the core theses that you already had. I'm curious, at what point did you decide that this was going to be a venture scale business?
Yeah. So what we did is we started working out of the Greylock office, on the concepts. we had, a lot of debates on exactly the right framing of like the first version and what could kind of kindle a network. And we had gotten to a prototype of something that was pretty efficient at getting like good insights out of people's heads. Because, I've been blogging for like 14 years. Most of my friends who are smarter than me, they just don't. Like, they've never gotten in that habit, but it doesn't mean they don't have like amazing insights to share with the world. They just don't have like a efficient vehicle and workflow to give it back. A lot of the stuff we were brainstorming on was like, okay, well, how do we make that easier with AI? So we had built a prototype that seemed to do a really good job at that. And it was, stitching together like voice cloning and like AI synthesis and voice dictation, all real time, all these things that were just like impossible to do the year prior. So it felt like, okay, we can learn how to wield these tools as weapons. We can get an output from it that advances this mission. That feels like something we can build a pretty significant, product and business over time on top of. So we kind of took that summer to bake it up a little bit. And, towards the end of summer, it's like, well, I'm obviously going full time on this. But for the first couple months, yeah, I wasn't sure, right? Like, it was like, yeah, we're just build and see what happens. And if it's not a fit, like, I'm just gonna tell Ludo, and if he wants to go on and do it, like, okay.
Did you start pitching in parallel other VCs and kind of got their feedback? And I mean, obviously you're working in the Greylock space, so obviously a safe space, and I know you're close to that team, given you're doing some advising there. But like, curious how you kind of validated just the private capital markets interest in the idea.
Yeah. So, we primarily talked to Greylock because I used to work there, and when I said we were thinking about working on this, they were just like, hey, how much capital do you need? Like, come work out of our office, just like, we'll take care of everything. And I've always felt like any time spent playing the like VC game of like positioning yourself, positioning the market, all of that is at an extreme cost to actually figuring out the product that's going to work. So I wanted to do as little of it as possible. So the only time we kind of extended to talking outside the Greylock family was like, my co-founder had not been in the VC community. So when someone's like, hey, heard you're working on something, we'd love to catch up, he'd be like, sure. And I'd be like, dude, why'd you say yes to that meeting? Like, we're not asking for money right now. Like, we can't just. So there's a couple of those where it's like, well, shit, I'm not gonna.
I'm one of those guys, by the way, Casey, just so you know. It's like I'm one of those guys like, hey, looks.
Hey, don't hate the player, hate the game. But like, I knew a little bit more about the game than he did. So there were a couple of those early on where like, oh, I can't believe we got suckered into this meeting, but like, I'm definitely not going to cancel it, because I know that person too. And so we use those as an excuse to being like, well, VC should be a customer of this as well. So like, let's see just how they think about it. So, and then, if you think about the intersection of what we're doing, kind of like a consumer network business with a consumer marketplace intention for monetization, there's a very short list of investors that care about those models. So if there were people that had any sort of that expertise, we went to them more so to like see what we could learn than to try to position ourselves to get them to compete with Greylock for the round. Like, we never actually did like our pitch deck. The only people that ever saw it were Greylock, right? Like, we never went and like pitched other VCs or anything. There are alternative futures where Greylock thought we were doing was total bullshit, and we would need to go do that, of course. But fortunately, we were able to make something work with them so that we didn't have to spend time on that. But we did end up talking to like a few other VCs, either through happenstance or there were just people that I had close relationships before, but it was less to position us for fundraising from them and more so a different perspective than we might have gotten from Greylock.
Did you have to build a deck for Greylock? I mean, did you, because they knew you and that you were there, I mean, I'm sure they had a lot of direct day-to-day knowledge of like what's going on. But a little bit.
They asked for one. So we did build one. I was a little annoyed in doing one because they were like, hey, just build a deck. It's not a big deal. Don't spend too much time on it. But like, we want to align the whole firm on what you've been building. Because we've been mainly talking to Mike and, catching up with, other people at the firm like Sam or Jerry every once in a while. So they were like, hey, come in and do like a formal pitch, but like, it's not a big deal. And so then you're in this weird position where you're like, well, if I was doing a formal fundraise, and going and talking to the Sequoias and the benchmarks and all of that of the world, I'd have spent like a month on a deck, right? To like really polish it in, really like stress test it with a bunch of fellow founders. But instead we spent, like a week or so on this thing. But then all the other decks they see have like a month more of polish. So it feels like you're being like set up to fail a little bit. And they're like, oh, it's not a big deal, but like, we just want to like make sure we're aligned. And then they ask you questions as if you've been like working on this for a year longer than you have. And you're like, yeah, dude, like, this was a one pager a week ago, there's still a lot we got to figure out here. So yeah, long story short, we did build a deck for Greylock. It looks pretty embarrassing now, but they were the only people that ever saw it. And afterwards, it sort of felt like the deck was irrelevant because they largely thought most of the stuff in the deck was pretty dumb, but fortunately, they didn't think we were dumb, and they liked the space and thought we would eventually figure out some good stuff to work on.
One, I'd love to see it, just for the folks that are watching and listening. But before we do that, like, do you think the actual exercise of creating a deck was helpful though? Like, just I mean, I know you want to do it well. I know you want to do it right. Obviously, you didn't have a lot of time to go do it, but just like reflecting back on that time, there are aspects that are probably useful. I mean, you've been on the VC side, so you've probably sat in these rooms. Like, decks are useful. So, like, how do you think about it, for folks that are listening that are founders?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's useful. Writing is thinking. And so a lot of times if you're just hashing things out live and building, you haven't really like spent the time to go to the level of depth. So whether it's building a deck or building a memo, it forces you to wrestle with some of those questions that maybe you haven't wrestled with as deeply as you thought prior to going through the exercise. So I think for us, looking back on that and trying to remember where we were at the time, I think going through the process, there were areas that we were like very strong on what we wanted to do because we had written a bunch of memos to ourselves or to talk to Mike or to talk to Reed, about, we were trying to do, or David Z was also someone at the firm that was very helpful in this period of time. Those were more around specific strategic decisions. And this was the first time we tried to like really wrap it all together and like, well, we've made all those strategic decisions and this is what it looks like. And, there are definitely, as you do that, you're like, yeah, this part feels kind of weak. And you wouldn't have necessarily have the visibility on that. And then when you actually go talk, to the firm as we did, both through the things they tell you directly and through the things, Mike tells you of the feedback he got after, you're going to get a sense of where you're weak. And, like any company that's like 3 months old at the time, there's just a lot of areas where your thinking isn't as strong as either you expected or as you want it to be.
And coming from your background, obviously having done a lot of growth work, advising a bunch of companies, like in retrospect, where did you feel like the gaps were, the areas that you'd advise other founders to go get good at when it comes to pitching or preparing for starting a company?
Well, something I did pretty well with my team at Pinterest, like if we were doing, a product review with Ben and Evan, is we go through the deck and then I'd be like, okay, well, here's what Ben cares about generally in product reviews. Here are the questions he's going to ask. Here's what Evan cares about in product reviews. Here's the questions he's going to ask. And here's what Jack, my boss, the head of product, cares about. And these are not the same things. So you kind of are able to go through this run through of like, well, I've anticipated these questions. Does the deck answer them before they're going to be asked? Right? That's ideally. And if it doesn't, do you know the right answer to that? Or are you kind of unprepared for what you're about to experience? And so I think I would have done more of an exercise of knowing, like, given the players in that meeting, some of whom I know pretty well because I did work there for a year and some of them are still there, like, Ashim or Jerry or Sam or Seth. And then some of the people that are new in there that I don't know, guess what they're going to care about, guess what they're going to dig in on, make sure that's either baked into the presentation or you have it like super pulled up, to reference, if those topics come up. I think we could do a better job of that. And I think that's something people make mistakes on in pitching, but also just, as general like product managers, executives. They don't think through it from the persona of every individual that matters in that meeting. And I'm not saying every individual in that meeting does matter, right? But there are many influences on the sponsor of your deal. We could have done a better job thinking through what those influences are going to say directly to us versus say to, Mike before or after that session.
And did you role play at all ahead of time? Like, did you practice some of these questions and figure out like what your answer would be? Like, how much ahead of time before that partner meeting did you go through this and obsess about it?
We did do some of that, but on, in retrospect, a way too constrained time frame. So I would have done a lot more of it. Look, it's weird to talk about our specific situation in retrospect. For the founders I've worked with, I would say you should have done a lot more work than we did. For us, it's almost like we were in a weird middle ground. We should have done like no work and basically said, we're Casey and Ludo. We've been working on network effect business for 20 years. We're going to do one of those, invest. Or like have something that was like way more polished, even if it ends up being untrue, because a bunch of the stuff hadn't been like super punched in the mouth yet. But like the story's like super tight. But that would have like postponed the meeting a month, right? Because of how young we were as a business. So we kind of like went for it and then felt a little dumb, for having done that. And then the feedback's a little bit like, yeah, you guys look dumb, but we know you're not dumb. And we want to be in business with you. And some of the stupid things you're hung up on, you're going to figure it out. And then you're like, okay, well then why do we do any of this work at all? Like I probably should have just put a deck with my resume and Ludo's resume in front of it and said like, this is what you're going to make the decision on anyway. So like, just decide if you like us or not.
Could we, Casey, could we go through the deck and you can kind of give a voiceover of the thought process around the structure and, how you thought about it at that time?
Yeah, I don't know if going through like the entirety of
Yeah,
it
whatever you
makes
think are
sense,
like
but
the key that told the story of what SuperMe was all about at that time.
yeah, let me, where is this share? Here we go.
Is this the first time you're sharing this deck with anybody outside of the folks at Greylock? I mean, obviously you've
Yes.
probably gone through some iterations, for your own personal use. So excited to see what a 1 week Casey deck looks like.
For
Oh,
sure.
wow, it looks amazing. It looks like pretty great already.
Okay, all right.
For
So
folks that
there
are
we
like
go.
building a deck in 1 week, like this is the standard.
It's not a default Google Slides template.
Well, we were
you did use
fortunate
Gamma.
that we had a brand designer from that we had worked with at Pinterest that we had help out with this, and he's excellent. Of course, now he works at Anthropic because who doesn't? But none of this is obviously our actual brand that's live on like the website or any of our materials today. But we didn't have anything, right? So like we worked with him to whip this up. So not exactly. Yeah. Okay. So it's basically like, all right, what are we doing? And this is the way we framed, the business at the time, which is we're the fastest way to learn from the best experts and showcase your own expertise. And, team slide, we did a little demo of what we had built so far. And, then we talked about, a bunch of the things that had changed that lead to how, professional careers are going to change, how knowledge sharing is going to change. So one is that knowledge sharing has shifted. There's kind of been more of a move away from sharing publicly to sharing a lot more privately in like WhatsApp groups and curated Slack groups. And therefore, like a lot of the best knowledge is becoming like more private over the last like 10 years and becoming, more public. And obviously, the biggest why now is like how we discover information has shifted with LLMs and the success of ChatGPT. But, we were like, basically, ChatGPT is great for facts, but in business, what you want are perspectives from people who have been there and done that. And so you're getting something's being lost when you shift from 10 blue links to one answer in the business world. And the way founders work is they code text a bunch of their friends for who knows about a problem. They then go try to talk to a bunch of different people who have been there, done that, and then they're going to make up their own minds. So we think that's more how information discovery, should work in the future with AI. And network graphs, it's like everyone's got a million connections on LinkedIn. You don't really know who any of these people are. So the ability to kind of like vet people has, declined dramatically, which, makes discovery of who knows what and who's worth hiring really poorly. And then employment options are shifting in that like right now, 99% of what's going on is full-time recruiting. That's going to become more of a spectrum between, more so kind of interim fractional stuff, which I had done, advising consulting, hiring the agent version of a person, to solve a specific problem, or just jumping on a video call and, paying $1,000 per hour for an acute problem. But all of it requires the same problem to be solved to enable all of those economic opportunities, which is knowing who has the most expertise and showcasing that. So that was kind of the why. And then there's kind of the target of like who we were targeting, the functional expert. So who are these people? They know a lot of things. They wish they were out there more, for their career. They're interested in better jobs, better hiring, more full-time opportunities. They're pretty senior, but they're not doing as much as they should because they don't know where to start. They don't want to be associated with platforms that they feel like undermine their brand. Self-promotion is pretty awkward for them. They don't want to look like they're trying too hard to make extra money. They're overwhelmed by the idea of like, well, if I start posting on LinkedIn, I'm gonna need to post like every day for it to matter. And that feels like a lot. They also don't want to like betray their company by sharing stuff they shouldn't. So even though they have like all of those issues, like they do want to share their knowledge with selling their souls. They definitely want to be perceived as experts in the market. They would love to make extra money without compromising their values, and they want to like stay relevant as AI is changing everything. What we're very confident is like there's a bunch of people who want to know these people, right? Founders solving company problems, executives trying to solve team problems, up and coming functional experts who want to become people like this, and then recruiters, and they have pretty crappy solutions to that today, right? They have to spam their network, they have to hire
And a
expensive
lot of these
recruiters, et
experts, I
cetera.
mean, you obviously have a great network, right, Casey? A lot of these folks, obviously recognize from kind of Reforge. A lot of these folks kind of are leaders at a lot of the tech companies in the Bay Area. How much of these folks help seeded the community that you're building? How much of this was like relationship based, where you're going out, you're leveraging your network to get these folks really excited about the problem that you're solving here, and how much of this okay,
Yeah, I mean, this was part of what we felt our unfair advantage of like,
100%.
we have together like 40 plus years of knowing who the best people are.
Hmm.
And we can add them to the network early on to get like great liquidity in some of these topics like pretty quickly that would otherwise be hard to find, hard to recruit, and you wouldn't necessarily know if you got the right people.
Were you obviously consumer, very hard, just hard to acquire. Obviously, you have a little bit of an advantage in terms of seeding the experts, which is kind of and sort of tapping into their networks, which ultimately could recruit audiences. I'd imagine, I mean, thinking about that pitch you did at Greylock, I mean, granted they knew you and so forth, like what were the big questions they were asking you that whether you were prepared or not prepared, that was the sort of overarching kind of like questions that made you kind of say, let me think about this.
So they were asking a lot about our entry point. Like, okay, well, like, how do you kindle the network, right? Just because you've got good people in your network doesn't mean you can find demand for them. Doesn't mean you can represent them well, with an AI representation of them, especially if you're saying a lot of them are in blogging or on a ton of podcasts, things like that. So a lot of questions around that. There were a lot of questions around like, you're kind of in this weird zone of like, this sounds like a very business oriented pitch, but this is a consumer product. Like, what is the culture of this company going to be? Like, how enterprise is it going to be, and how quickly? Greylock has a reputation of being one of the top enterprise firms in the world, and they just print IPOs in that space. So they're kind of like, but that's not who you guys are. So like, if you're going to need to sell the business quickly, like, how is this playing out? How is this like sequencing, right? We felt very strongly that this needs to be like a public consumer facing network that can get pulled more internally over time. But if you start internal first, you're never going to get outside the walls of any specific company. That's going to limit your network effects. That's going to limit your ability to drive engagement. So we were like prepared to handle that objectively, but there's such a strong bias from certain people in that room that it almost feels like, unless I answer, well, we're just going to become an enterprise company and we're going to learn how to do enterprise sales from you guys because you're the best, they weren't going to like the answer. So that's kind of a little bit of a lesson of just kind of knowing who you're working with in there. But definitely the weakest part was, oh, we see your entry point, and kind of the feedback a little bit was like, we don't really like it. What other ideas you got around your entry point? And we had a bunch of other ideas, some of which they liked more, some of which they liked less. But I was sort of hoping that they give us more trust on figuring that out versus like breaking down like multiple significant ideas on network kindling.
Did they any consumer kind of business, it's like, how do we scale? How do we grow? How do we find more experts? How do we repeat both sides of the marketplace? Like, I mean, obviously you all know this, right? Because this is the level of expertise, but like there's always the classic, oh, this is great, but it's hard. Is which I'm sure you hear all the time from others. But like in this case, what was discussed about that other than like, oh yeah, we're just gonna trust, Casey and Ludo to like figure it out.
Yeah, so, we had some slides on kind of like the entry points. We had some slides on, the different growth loops we were gonna pursue. And then there were specific, like some pinpoints on some of them to like understand them better. But yeah, there was definitely a decent amount of conversation on how do you attract supply, how do you attract demand, and how do you make it feel like the cross-site network effect is really starting to turn where, the product kind of grows while you sleep versus you like, pushing a rock uphill.
And how much did you share when you were working on this first deck? Here's how much I'm trying to raise, right? And here's the milestones I'm going to hit. I mean, it's obviously like no one, it's the path there is always bumpy, but like, did you present, hey, here's what I'd like, here's what I'd like to do, and to the extent you feel comfortable sharing, like, what were the goals you were setting out to achieve?
Yeah, good question. So we didn't put it in the deck, but we had those conversations ahead of time with Mike. And, for us, we didn't really know, right? So there were some friends of ours that were raising like 30 million out the gate, at the time. So I was like, should we do that? Um, and as we talked to other consumer founders, like, we talked to Ben at Pinterest, right? We talked to Ben Rubin, who I worked with a lot at House Party because they were a Greylock investment. And everyone was like, oh, no, no, no. Consumer network kindling, like, dude, definitely don't raise over 10 million. Like, definitely keep the team really small. The coordination costs are super high while you're figuring out how to build like the exact network product. You're not gonna like if you raise more than 10, there's no way you're gonna spend any of it in like the first like 3 years. So you're just gonna like dilute yourself for no reason. So we kind of got that feedback enough to being like, okay, like I get why other people are pursuing other strategies, but we should be like 5 to 7, 5 to 8, something like that. You have that conversation with Mike initially, right? One-on-one, there's a certain feedback. And then when Mike really has that conversation with the rest of the firm, there's a set of revealed preferences that come out, right? And I think from the VC side, and you might have variations of these, you realize that there's some principles, right? One of them is like, okay, well, consumer, unbounded upside, but lower success rate from 0 to 1. So we don't really care that much about valuation as much as we care about not putting up too much capital in too early, right? So that became like a revealed preference that we learned. And that ended up in aligning to, more of the fundraising strategy we decided to pursue. But if we had decided we wanted to go big, like some of our friends, like that would have probably been in some ways a non-starter with Greylock. And then we probably would have trusted the feedback less because the feedback of you guys shouldn't be raising this much more so feels like CYA from a venture firm rather than like it coming from other consumer founders. So I felt really good in retrospect that we had done that kind of work to figure out the right thing for us. And that ended up being true just in terms of building the company for the next year and a half of like, definitely think that was the right advice. But probably if we had done more discovery work, we could have known more of those preferences for this particular firm or potentially from the market for our style of business prior to doing, the actual deck.
I was gonna say, are there any other kind of insights that you were able to pick up from talking to other founders that were non-obvious at the time? Right, I think the standard rule of thumb, a lot of founders tell founders raise as much money as you possibly can, and capitalize the company heavily. And we see this, I think, even more now in this kind of AI boom that we're in. Are there any non-obvious advice that you got other than in the context of being a B2C company here?
Well, there was a little bit the follow on to that statement, right? Of basically every founder we talked to being like, hey, you want to raise a lot less than some of your friends are doing in B2B. You want to keep the team a lot smaller than, because we were, kind of incubating a Greylock, meaning like we spent all our time there, but we were just building. And they were incubating all of these like cybersecurity companies, enterprise companies next to us. And they would go from like 2 to 10 employees in weeks. And so at some point I was like, ask Corinne, I'm like, what's the deal? And she's like, look, totally irrelevant to you guys, but in B2B, they just have all these check boxes they need to hit before they can actually go to market at all. And some of that is, product, and some of that is just go to market. Like I need SOC 2, I need a person that can talk to these people, whatever. So Greylock has a playbook that's going to get a team to like 12 people fairly quickly. And they're like, we would never tell, your company to do that. But this was, just kind of like while Ludo and I have been in the game a long time, we've never founded a venture-backed company before, right? So it's just like figuring all this stuff out. Oh, and then another element that I think emerged, which ended up being true, is that when you raise small and, limit how much dilution you take as a consumer company, and what you build is halfway interesting, then you can like get more capital at a higher valuation, less dilutive later, like pretty easily. And yeah, there's a small number of firms and partners that look at those deals. But when they do, and you prove that you can actually like get a real product out and that it's cool, you can go get that extra capital later if you care about needing it. So it's really like, yeah, you're gonna end up getting your 30 million, but you're gonna break it up into 2 parts separated by 6 months, a year, and you're gonna end up diluting less in the process as a result. So I think some people that were further ahead of us told us that. And I think they were accurate. I think what's interesting about talking to consumer 0 to 1 founders is most of their advice on actually kindling the company is quite useless. They almost have like total blockage on what actually happened during those periods of time. So we kept talking to founders and they were like, just build cool shit and like see what sticks and then iterate. And I'm like, gee, thanks, bro. Like really needed your time to hear that. And then there were a few that had like really strong opinions, not necessarily ones we followed, but those were like the more interesting conversations. Like some of the founders we talked to were like, you just have to price this product immediately to make sure people really value it. Otherwise you're not really sure where you're at product market fit. And it's like, we didn't take that advice for various reasons, but it was really important for us to hear it and debate it because it just wasn't something we were considering at the time. So I really appreciated those conversations, but feels like if a consumer founder is like 3 to 5 years removed from the actual 0 to 1 process, the only part they remember is the PR narrative versus like the actual grind, because the grind was just too hard and they blocked it from memory.
Yeah, it's like having kids. If you remember how sleepless the nights were the first year, you probably wouldn't have a second kid.
Totally. Yeah. It's like genetics in some way, or else we would not survive as a species.
What is when you look back at the deck and as you were flipping through it, where you're like, oh man, like you made some interesting choices. One, you did the demo early, which I mean, what that tells me is that your demo was fucking great. I mean, because most
I
people,
think we were high on our own supply,
embarrassed.
to be honest. Look, I think what our demo objectively did is it showed things that had never been done before with AI that no one had ever considered. But that doesn't mean it's cool. And I think we had 2 knocks on that we didn't anticipate. One is while people thought it was technically interesting, they didn't think it was cool. And there were many parts of that they were right. It wasn't cool. The parts that were cool, they just weren't ready to hear about yet. So when we sync with them later on, we hear feedback like, look, we just didn't really understand this concept. You guys were like 6-9 months ahead of us on what AI could do here. So at the time, they kind of dismissed it. And now they're like, oh no, you were absolutely right. We just like, our brains weren't there. And we knew consumer AI and applying AI to networks was a brand new concept, right? There weren't any networked AI companies out there. We felt objectively it was a little bit early to building them. Like if you look at mobile, it was all prosumer, bizumer stuff the first couple years, simple single player magic trick stuff until, a few years later, Uber, DoorDash, Snapchat, all of them actually came out. And that's, where of course the majority of the value accrued in mobile. And we knew like those were 3 to 4 years after the iPhone, not like 6 months. And we're like, well, hopefully we're not too early. It's just kind of how we felt, because if we didn't pursue it now, it probably just wasn't going to happen ever for us. And we felt a little bit of that with the demo, that we thought people were going to grok a little bit more immediately. So yeah, in retrospect, I don't know if that was a good call.
Would you have not done, like, now that in hindsight, would you like, oh, I think the demo was the right move? I mean, obviously you did it and you succeeded in inspiring the group of people to be part of this journey.
We felt it was important for people to know we weren't full of shit and that we could build. But like part of the demo didn't actually work correctly, which was in like a really strange way, like 1 in 100, bug. So that was embarrassing. And we had onboarded, most of the GPs at Greylock onto the product earlier. So they had already kind of seen it that way. So I think there probably wasn't as much advantage to the live demo. I think there was another component to the product, which we ended up deciding to show like in the deck versus demo that worked pretty well, which is you'd ask this question on ChatGPT or Perplexity and you'd get an answer. And then you'd ask it on SuperMe and you'd see the answer. And it felt like the answer was like 5 years into the future because literally one of the best people in the world on that topic is like, the people we were sourcing from for the answer. So I think that part worked pretty well. The other component, which was the self-cast where you like talk into the mic, it synthesizes your thoughts, clones your voice in the process. We thought it was cool. They didn't think it was cool. They were right. And we needed more time to be able to absorb how correct they were.
Makes sense. And I'm curious, Casey. So obviously a lot of learning since you did this. What's new now with the company?
Yeah. So what's interesting about building, like telling this sort of story is, so much of what you're talking about in a series seed pitch is what the tech is capable of doing at the time. And in previous cycles, like the tech doesn't change that dramatically. And in AI, it's changing very materially multiple times a year. So what's materially different now is, the product where we like get you to talk, to pull stuff out of your head. We don't even have that product anymore. It worked. People said amazing things. We synthesized it well to make them sound smart, but it just wasn't viral. Like people didn't do it often enough. It was a little too clever showcase of how we were using the tools rather than something that could really like kickstart a network. And then our GTM plan early on was about infiltrating professional communities, and that had all these amazing operators, and the community value prop just really wasn't landing. So it was more so that as we pivoted to just building a great profile based on your public content and enabling you to sync private content like, Google Docs, Granola, etc. And that giving you like an amazing profile day one, that people were like more impressed and started to respond better. What's different now, right, which, like kind of multiple model changes is when we built these, AI profiles, they were just there to represent you to other people, which means they didn't add a lot of value to more junior people that weren't going to get a bunch of questions coming their way. And now your profile doesn't just represent you to other people's, it knows everything about you, which means it knows how to extract maximum value out of the rest of the network as well. So it knows what you're working on, if you've synced, some of your sources. It can go have chats with multiple other SuperMe profiles at the same time. It can goal seek in those chats, come back and report what it learns, once it's got enough value from them, which means you don't need to like prompt every question like we had in the first version. And now you can do all this stuff wherever you work, right? With MCP or API. And none of that stuff was in the original pitch because MCP didn't even exist yet, right? And group chats with AIs just was not possible, right? Like that really did become possible until like, Opus, like in the fall of last year. So they're sort of like, yeah, that was always kind of part of the original vision, but we didn't talk about it because the tech wasn't there yet. And we didn't know if that was a year away or 2 years away. And spoiler alert is like the tech has moved faster than we thought. And some of it is like, look, that just wasn't the right kindling idea. And we had to get off our high horse and move to the next idea to find things that were like more promising. And that's where like our onboarding and getting agentic and pulling everything we know from the internet about you immediately and syncing it immediately like that's way easier and worked way better than what we were doing before, but like maybe didn't actually work in the summer when we had prototyped, the original idea.
Yeah, we just shipped agentic onboarding at Clarify, and it's been a game changer.
For sure.
For folks that are, listening as we kind of wrap up here, if you're giving advice to your founder self, a year and a half ago when you were just getting started, what advice would you give founders who are earlier on putting their first pitch together, and just getting started on the journey? And let's specifically talk about consumer focused companies, given, this is the area that you have deep expertise in.
Oh, totally. Right. So I think there's different advice if you care about playing the short-term game versus you care about being around and having an iconic company in 10 years. So I'll always bias toward the latter, but I need to reference that some of what I say in that will not appeal to a bunch of VCs in this current environment. Is if you look at the history of consumer companies that create incredible outcomes, most of them are network effect oriented. And what I see with a lot of consumer companies is like cute single player magic trick sort of thing, maybe viral now, but it's going to mainly be like paid supported growth long term. And those companies just basically always crap out before they can get like a public exit. Like they just can't make it. Even some of the best ones from the mobile generation didn't quite make it. And sure, there's always an outlier like Duolingo, but like it's a very, very big outlier compared to like the network effect companies are just still worth a lot more than that company, and there's way more of them. So I think the things I look for is like, okay, well, like, are you developing a data network effect? Are you developing cross-site network effect? If you're developing a direct network effect, how's it going to involve the other two network effects? Because direct network effect businesses never monetize well. And what's going to be your secret angle on user acquisition? If you're just telling me you're going to go do TikTok and viral videos on X, like that's already mostly arbed out. I need to know like what's actually gonna be your sustainable secret sauce on acquiring users, because part of what drives consumer outcomes is very cheap cost of acquisition. And look, I wish there was totally new viral loops being emerged with AI that we could all go, penetrate before everyone else gets to them, or, totally new, incredibly cheap ads, maybe ChatGPT ads will be the way Facebook ads were back in 2012. But right now, those things aren't materially there. So I need to know you've got something special versus like, yeah, I'm just going to do all the standard things. All the standard things are way too expensive for consumer companies now. So those are kind of the two major things I look at. And then we dive in deeper from there on like who the customer is, things like that.
Well, Casey, I really appreciate you being on the first pitch. As we wrap up, where can folks find you online?
Yeah, SuperMe.ai, of course, is the best place to find me. I still do have an X and a LinkedIn. At one caseman on X, if you want to talk to me there. And then my blog is caseyaccidental.com.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining.
Thanks, Casey.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.